There are wounds that no victory can heal, and King Rurik carried them all. For 10 years, he had ruled the mountain kingdom of Valdris alone, having sealed his heart the day he buried his queen and banished every woman from his court. His castle had become a tomb of stone and silence, where only the echo of boots on cold floors marked the passing of time. Then a starving woman named Alinor appeared at his gates, asking for bread, not gold. She looked at him without fear, without the trembling that had become so familiar from his subjects. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that reminded him of everything he had lost. In that moment, the king who had forgotten how to feel anything but rage felt something crack inside his chest. What happens when a man who is sworn off love meets the one person who doesn't want his crown? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain kingdom of Valdris stood like a fortress against the sky, its stone walls carved from the very cliffs that had protected it for 3 centuries. Snow clung to the battlements even in late spring, and the wind that swept through the passes carried the bite of eternal winter. It was a land that bred hard men and harder choices, where survival meant strength and weakness invited death. King Rurik Ironhand stood at the great window of his throne room, watching the mist roll through the valleys below. At 47, he remained a giant among men, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a kingdom and his hands scarred by decades of warfare. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, fell to his shoulders in the old way, bound with leather cords that had seen 100 battles. The crown of Valdris, heavy gold set with mountain sapphires, rested not on his head, but on the windowsill beside him, as if even that symbol of power felt too burdensome this morning. Behind him, mounted above the twin thrones that dominated the great hall, hung Ironwill, his war hammer of legend. The weapon had earned its name in the siege of Corvin Pass, where Rurik had shattered an entire battalion's shield wall with 13 devastating swings. That was 20 years ago, when he had been carving his kingdom from the blood and stone of these mountains, when every dawn brought new battles and every sunset counted new victories. The second throne, carved from the same ancient oak as his own, sat draped in black silk. It had been 10 years since Queen Alara had graced that seat, 10 years since her laughter had echoed through these halls, 10 years since Rurik had known what it meant to love something more than conquest. The black cloth served as both memorial and reminder, a daily testament to his greatest failure and his most sacred vow. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds, casting the throne room in shades of gray that matched Rurik's mood. Commander Thane approached with the measured steps of a man who had learned to read his king's temper in the set of his shoulders. At 52, Thane bore the weathered face of a career soldier, his beard more silver than brown, his left hand bearing only 3 fingers, the price of standing at Rurik's side through 17 major campaigns. "The morning reports, Your Majesty," Thane said, his voice carefully neutral. Rurik didn't turn from the window. "Speak." "Border patrols report movement in the Drakemore passes. Nothing substantial, small groups, possibly scouts. Lord Garrett requests permission to send a full company to investigate." "Denied." Rurik's voice carried the finality of mountain stone. "Double the watch rotations. Nothing more." Thane hesitated. It was a small pause, barely perceptible, but Rurik heard it like thunder. "Is there something else, old friend?" "The villages, sire. They're struggling. The harvest was poor last season, and with the borders sealed to trade, the borders remain closed." Rurik finally turned, and Thane saw the familiar granite expression that had become his king's perpetual mask. "We are strong because we stand alone. We survived because we trusted no one outside these walls." "Yes, sire. But the people are alive because of the choices I made." Rurik's hand instinctively moved to the chain around his neck, where a simple gold band hung hidden beneath his tunic, Alara's wedding ring, worn close to his heart like a wound that never healed. They are fed because of the grain stores I commanded. They are safe because of the walls I built. They will endure because endurance is what Valdris breeds. Thane bowed his head. Of course, your majesty. In the silence that followed, brother, Marcus entered the hall with the soft footsteps of a man who had spent 30 years walking these stones. The castle's priest and keeper of records, Marcus had served 3 kings of Valdris, but none had tested his faith quite like Rurik, where once the morning prayer had been a ceremony of gratitude attended by the full court. Now it was a private ritual shared only by king and priest in the empty chapel. Your Majesty, Marcus said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of age and wisdom. The morning prayers will wait. Rurik moved to his throne and settled into its embrace with the weariness of a man carrying a decade of solitude. What? Word from the village councils? Marcus consulted the parchment in his hands. Elder Willem reports 3 births this month, 2 deaths, both elderly. The blacksmith requests additional iron for spring plowshares. The miller's wheel requires repair before the next grain delivery. These reports had become Rurik's connection to the people he ruled, clinical, distant, reduced to numbers and necessities. He had once walked among his subjects, had known their names and their children's names, had celebrated their marriages and mourned their losses. But that was before the betrayal that had cost him everything that mattered. See that they have what they need, Rurik commanded. But remind Elder Willem that requests for trade expeditions will continue to be denied. Valdris provides for Valdris. As Marcus departed, Rurik found himself alone again with his thoughts and his ghosts. The great hall, designed to host hundreds, echoed with emptiness. Once, this space had been alive with conversation, with the rustle of silk gowns and the soft laughter of court ladies, with the music of lutes and the gentle debate of scholars. Alara had insisted on bringing beauty to balance his strength, culture to soften his warfare, wisdom to temper his justice. Now it housed only soldiers and servants, men who spoke in clipped sentences and moved with military precision. The tapestries had been taken down, too many memories woven into their threads. The great hearth burned with practical efficiency rather than welcoming warmth. Even the air felt different, as if joy itself had been banished along with all female presence. Miles below in the village that nestled in Valdris's shadow, Alinor of Millhaven woke to another day of careful survival. Her cottage sat at the edge of the settlement, a modest stone structure that had housed her family for 3 generations before war claimed them all. At 34, she had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between eating and going hungry, the way morning light caught the frost, the direction of the wind, the particular gray of clouds that promised snow or merely threatened it. Her hands, calloused from years of work that gentlewomen had never known, moved efficiently through her morning routine. The fire needed building. The small garden needed tending. And today, she would need to make the journey to the market square to trade her meager surplus of winter preserves for grain. It was a careful calculation, what she could spare against what she needed, measured in cups and spoonfuls against the approaching lean months. The silver locket at her throat caught the firelight as she bent to coax flames from last night's embers. It was her one treasure, inherited from the mother she barely remembered, a simple oval containing a pressed wild from the meadows that no longer existed, claimed by 10 years of harsh winters and harsher policies. Sometimes she caught herself touching it during difficult moments, drawing strength from the connection to a gentler time. Alinor had been 24 when the great change came, when King Rurik sealed the kingdom and declared that Valdris would stand alone against the world. She remembered the night Queen Alara died, how the bells had tolled until dawn, how grown men had wept openly in the streets, how the very stones of the castle seemed to dim with grief. She remembered, too, the decree that followed. No woman would be permitted in royal court. No marriages would be celebrated in the great chapel. No festivals would mark the turning seasons. The kingdom had obeyed because Rurik commanded it, because his grief was too terrible to question, because the alternative to his iron rule might be no rule at all. But 10 years was a long time to live under winter's shadow, and Alinor, like many of her generation, sometimes wondered what life might have been if sorrow had not frozen their king's heart as she prepared for the day's journey to the castle. If sorrow had not frozen their king's heart as she prepared for the day's as she prepared for the day's journey to the castle. If sorrow had not frozen their king's heart as she prepared for the desperate venture driven by dwindling food stores and growing desperation, Alinor could not know that she was walking toward a destiny that would change not only her own life, but the fate of every soul in Valdris. She knew only that hunger was a patient teacher, and today it was time for another lesson in survival. The storm arrived without warning, as mountain storms often did, turning a gray morning into a white blind fury that made the journey to castle Valdris a test of will against nature. Alinor pulled her worn cloak tighter and pressed forward through snow that stung like thrown sand, each step a deliberate choice to continue rather than turn back to the meager safety of her cottage. She had made this walk a dozen times over the years, trading small goods for smaller coins, but never in conditions like these. The path that wound up the mountainside toward the castle gates had become treacherous with ice and fresh snow, and more than once she found herself steadying against the stone markers that guided travelers in better weather. Her breath came in sharp clouds that the wind tore away before they could form, and her fingers, despite their wool wrappings, had long since lost feeling. But hunger was a harder master than weather, and the last of her preserved vegetables would not stretch another week. The castle kitchen sometimes purchased goods from villagers, not often, and never for generous prices, but enough to mean survival for another month. It was a gamble that grew more desperate with each passing season, but desperation had become a familiar companion in the years since the kingdom closed its borders. The first challenge came at the outer gates, where guards in thick cloaks stamped, their feet against the cold, and regarded her approach with the suspicion that had become second nature to all who served in King Rurik's fortress. Captain Bowen, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of battles fought in warmer climates, stepped forward as she approached. "State your business, woman." The word carried 10 years' worth of unease, as if he had almost forgotten how to address her gender. "I seek audience with the kitchen master," Alinor replied, her voice steady despite the cold that made her jaw ache. "I have preserves to trade." Bowen exchanged glances with his fellow guards. In the early years after the Great Change, such requests had been common enough, but time had worn away the village women's hope of fair commerce with the castle. Most had learned to make do with what they could grow or trade among themselves. "The kitchen master sees no one without the steward's permission," Bowen said. "And the steward sees no one without the king's permission," Alinor finished. "Yes, I know the way of things. But a storm like this might delay supply wagons, and fresh goods could be welcome in the kitchens. If His Majesty's men go hungry because protocol prevented practical trade, will that serve the kingdom well?" It was a bold argument, bordering on impertinence, but delivered with such calm reasoning that Bowen found himself considering it. The woman stood before him without the trembling deference that had characterized most petitioners in recent years. Her brown eyes held steady contact with his, and her posture, despite the obvious cold and weariness, remained straight with quiet dignity. "Wait here," he commanded, and disappeared into the gatehouse. The minutes stretched as Alinor stood in the courtyard, snow collecting on her shoulders like a mantle of winter lace. Around her, The castle bustled with the activity of men who had learned to function without feminine presence, soldiers moving with military precision, servants carrying supplies with efficient economy, stable hands tending horses with professional competence. It was a world that ran like a well-oiled machine, but one that hummed with a strange emptiness, as if some essential element had been removed from its design. When Captain Bowen returned, his expression carried surprise mixed with apprehension. "His Majesty will see you directly." Alinor felt a flutter of shock in her chest. In all her years of trading with the castle, she had never progressed beyond the kitchen staff. The idea of standing before King Rurik himself, the man whose grief had shaped a decade of her life and the lives of every person in Valdris, was both terrifying and inexplicably thrilling. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows, its massive hearth throwing dancing light across walls lined with the weapons and banners of conquest. At the far end, 2 thrones commanded the space, one occupied by the imposing figure of the king, the other draped in black silk that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. King Rurik sat forward slightly as she approached, his intense blue eyes fixed on her with an attention that made her acutely aware of every step. This close, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines etched by years of command and sorrow, the powerful hands that rested on the carved arms of his throne. He was larger than she had expected, broader and more imposing, but it was not his physical presence that made her breath catch. It was the intensity of his regard, as if he were seeing something that surprised him as much as it did her. "You are the woman who seeks to trade with my kitchens," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, tempered by something that might have been curiosity. "I am, Your Majesty." Alinor inclined her head in proper deference, but did not drop her gaze. "I offer preserved vegetables and dried herbs in exchange for grain or coin, whatever your kitchen master deems fair." Rurik leaned back in his throne, studying her with the intensity of a man examining a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. Around the hall, courtiers and guards watched with barely concealed fascination. It had been 10 years since a woman had stood before the throne of Valdris. 10 years since any female voice had echoed through these stone halls. "What is your name?" the king asked. "Alinor of Millhaven, Your Majesty." "And you made this journey in such weather for the sake of trade?" "I made this journey because hunger teaches hard lessons, Your Majesty, and I am a diligent student." The response drew a sharp intake of breath from several observers. Such directness bordered on insolence when addressing the crown. But Rurik's expression did not darken with anger. Instead, something flickered across his features that might have been recognition, or perhaps surprise at encountering honesty untempered by fear. "Hunger," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I imagine it does." He rose from his throne with the fluid power of a man who had never lost his warrior's conditioning, and descended the steps until he stood only an arm's length from where Alinor waited. This close, she could see the chain at his throat, the careful way he held himself, the weight of solitude that sat on his shoulders like invisible armor. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, he said quietly, almost to himself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a decade of isolation and grief. Around the hall, the silence deepened until even the crackling of the great fire seemed subdued. Alinor felt something shift in the moment, some current of possibility that she could not name but could not ignore. Then, before she could speak, before anyone could move or breathe or think, King Rurik stepped forward and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss or a tentative one. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten what tenderness felt like and was startled to remember. His hands framed her face with surprising care, and for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the great hall of Valdris held only 2 people discovering something neither had expected to find. When he drew back, his eyes held a mixture of shock and wonder as if he had surprised himself more than anyone else. Alinor stood frozen, her own shock warring with something deeper and more complex. The recognition that this moment had changed everything, that whatever came next would reshape not only her life, but the life of every person in the kingdom. "You will be my queen," Rurik announced to the hall, his voice carrying absolute certainty. The great hall erupted into barely suppressed chaos, whispered conversations, shocked expressions, the sound of someone dropping a ceremonial staff. But Alinor heard none of it. She was looking into the eyes of a king who had just made a declaration that neither of them fully understood, wondering how a simple request for bread had become a moment that would echo through history. The royal chambers assigned to Alinor felt like a beautiful prison. Tapestries in deep burgundy and gold-covered walls that seemed to stretch impossibly high, and a bed large enough for 3 people dominated the space with its carved posts and silk curtains. Everything spoke of luxury beyond her imagination, yet the very grandeur of it made her feel smaller, more insignificant, more aware of how far she was from the simple stone cottage that had been her world for 34 years. A servant, a faint, nervous young man named Peter, who looked as though he had never spoken to a woman in his life, had brought her clothing befitting her new station. The gowns were beautiful, cut from fabrics that caught the light like captured starshine, but they felt foreign against her skin. The sleeves were too long, the bodices too fitted, the trains too cumbersome for someone accustomed to practical skirts and sturdy boots. "This is madness," she whispered to her reflection in the polished silver mirror, touching the heavy golden crown that rested on the vanity before her. The crown of Valdris was an ancient thing, passed down through generations of queens, its mountain sapphires and intricate metalwork speaking of craftsmanship from a more elegant age. But on her head, it felt like wearing someone else's life, too heavy, too grand, too impossible. 3 days had passed since the king's startling announcement, and in that time Alinor had seen him only briefly, at meals served in strained silence, while courtiers watched her every movement for signs of worthiness or failure. The conversations around her were careful, neutral discussions of weather and supplies that revealed nothing of what anyone truly thought about their king's impulsive decision. She had tried to maintain some connection to her former life, insisting on helping the kitchen staff with meal preparations, but such attempts were met with horror from the servants and disapproval from the nobles. "Queens do not need bread," Lady Catherine had informed her with icy politeness. Though the woman's title was largely ceremonial, her late husband had been one of Rurik's war companions, and she now served as something between advisor and keeper of protocol. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. In the village, Alinor had known every face, every family, every small triumph and tragedy that shaped the community. Here, she moved through a world of strangers who regarded her with mixtures of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed resentment. The servants were kind enough, but distant. She was royalty now, separated from them by an invisible barrier of rank. The nobles were courteous but cold, making it clear that they saw her as an unfortunate impulse that would hopefully be corrected given time. Commander Thane proved to be an unexpected ally, perhaps because his loyalty to Rurik transcended his opinions about royal marriages. He took it upon himself to explain the routines of castle life, the expectations of court protocol, and the delicate balance of personalities that kept the kingdom functioning. His Majesty has not been himself since. Thane paused, choosing his words carefully as they walked through the armory, where weapons waited in neat rows like sleeping soldiers. That is to say, he has carried heavy burdens for many years. Your presence here has stirred waters that have been still for a long time. I never asked to stir anything, Alinor replied. I came seeking bread, not a crown. Sometimes the gods send us what we need rather than what we seek, Brother Marcus observed. appearing from behind a display of ceremonial shields with the quiet way he had of materializing wherever wisdom might be needed. Though I will grant that their methods often confuse us mortals. That evening, Alinor made her first real attempt to influence castle policy, approaching Rurik as he reviewed reports in his private study. The room reflected its owner functional, austere, dominated by maps and military treatises rather than the comforts that might soften the edges of absolute power. "Your Majesty," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to address the man who had kissed her so suddenly and then retreated behind the formal barriers of kingship. "I would like to make a request." Rurik looked up from the parchment in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "Speak." "The villages are struggling. With winter lasting so long and the borders closed to trade, people are running short of basic supplies. Perhaps the castle stores could spare some grain." "No." The word came swift and final, like the slam of a gate. "But Your Majesty, if you could see—" I said no. Rurik set down his papers and fixed her with a stare that reminded her exactly who ruled this kingdom. "The castle stores are maintained for the castle's needs. The villages have survived 10 years under these policies, and they will continue to survive. This kingdom endures because it does not scatter its resources to every plea for charity." "Charity?" Alinor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "These are your people, not beggars. They work the fields that feed your armies. They mine the metals that forge your weapons. They live under my protection." Rurik interrupted, rising from his chair with the controlled movement of a man keeping tight rein on his temper. "They breathe because I have kept this kingdom safe from the enemies that would see them all dead or enslaved. They sleep peacefully because I have built walls strong enough to keep the wolves at bay. Do not presume to lecture me about my obligations to people whose lives I have spent 10 years preserving." The argument hung between them like a drawn blade, sharp and dangerous. Alinor saw in his eyes not just authority, but pain, the look of a man who had made impossible choices and lived with their consequences every day. Yet she also saw something else, something that reminded her of the moment when he had spoken of not seeing a woman in 10 years, a glimpse of the person buried beneath the armor of absolute rule. "I do not presume to lecture you," she said quietly. "I only ask you to remember that strength can take many forms. Sometimes the greatest protection we can offer is compassion." For a moment, something flickered across Rurik's features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But then his expression hardened again, and he turned back to his papers. "You are dismissed," he said without looking up. That night, alone in her magnificent chambers, Alinor stood at the window, looking down at the village lights that twinkled like earthbound stars in the valley below. Each light represented a family, a life, a story of quiet endurance that the king seemed determined to acknowledge only in terms of duty and protection. She touched her mother's locket, feeling the familiar comfort of its simple silver warmth, and wondered if accepting a crown meant abandoning the person she had been, or if there might be a way to use her unexpected position to bridge the distance between the throne and the people it was meant to serve. The discovery came by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Alinor had been exploring the castle's endless corridors, trying to map the maze of chambers and halls that would be her world for the foreseeable future, when she found the door that should not have existed. It was tucked behind a tapestry depicting the Battle of Crimson Dale, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look, and it opened onto a staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. At the top, she found what had once been Queen Alara's private chambers. The rooms had been preserved like a shrine to memory, every detail maintained exactly as it had been on the day their occupant died. A crystal perfume bottle sat on the vanity, its contents long evaporated, but the lavender scent still clinging faintly to the stopper. Books lay open on reading tables, as if their reader had merely stepped away for a moment. Gowns hung in the wardrobe, their silk and velvet untouched by time, but heavy with the weight of absence. On the writing desk, Alinor found a leather-bound journal filled with pressed flowers and detailed notes in elegant handwriting. Plans for the spring garden. Read the title page, followed by page after page of carefully drawn diagrams showing beds of herbs and flowers, fruit trees, and vegetable plots, all designed to bring beauty and sustenance to the castle grounds. The final entry was dated 3 days before Queen Elara's death. The roses should be planted along the south wall, where they will catch the morning sun. Rurik says he has no time for flowers, but he always smiles when he sees them blooming. Alinor spent hours in those rooms, learning about the woman whose shadow she was meant to fill. Elara had been more than a queen. She had been a diplomat, a scholar, a gardener who believed that beauty and nurture were as important as strength and conquest. Letters tucked into the journal revealed a woman who had worked tirelessly to balance her husband's military nature with wisdom and compassion, who had seen the potential for Valdris to be more than just a fortress against the world. The garden plans particularly captured Alinor's attention. According to the detailed notes, there had once been extensive growing plots throughout the castle grounds, providing not only beauty but practical herbs for the kitchens and healing plants for the infirmary. The diagrams showed a sophisticated understanding of which plants grew well together, how to maximize yields in the mountain climate, and how to create spaces that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. When she finally descended to the main castle, Alinor carried the journal with her like a treasure map to a lost world. That evening, as the court gathered for the evening meal, she approached Commander Thane with a question that had been building in her mind all day. "The Queen's gardens," she said quietly as they stood near the great hearth. "What happened to them?" Thane's weathered face darkened. "They were abandoned. After Her Majesty's death, the king ordered them left untended. Said the kingdom had no time for such frivolities. But surely the herbs, at least the practical plants that the kitchens and infirmary needed. We purchase such things from traveling merchants when they're available," Thane replied. "Or the villages provide what they can spare, at greater expense than growing them ourselves. That," Thane said carefully, "is not a question of economics. It is a question of remembrance and pain." That night, Alinor made her way to the castle grounds under cover of darkness, carrying a small lamp to light her exploration. What she found broke her heart. The garden spaces were still there, but they had become wild and overgrown, choked with weeds and thorny vines that had claimed the carefully planned beds. Here and there, she could see the bones of what had been stone borders, the remains of trellises, even a few hardy perennial herbs that had somehow survived a decade of neglect. The next morning brought news that would prove the first test of her new position. Scout reports indicated unusual activity in the borderlands, not armies, but smaller groups moving through the mountain passes with purposes unknown. In the war council that followed, Alinor found herself included almost by accident, present in the room when the discussion began, and too uncertain of protocol to excuse herself. "Double the border patrols," Lord Garrett recommended, his scarred hand spread across the map that dominated the council table. "If these are scouts for a larger force, we need to know their intentions before they can report back." Or, Alinor found herself saying before wisdom could stop her, "We could send an envoy to determine what they seek. If they are merely traitors or refugees, treating them as enemies might create hostilities where none existed." The silence that followed was profound. Lord Garrett stared at her as if she had suggested surrendering the castle to the first army that asked nicely. Even Brother Marcus looked uncertain, though his expression held more curiosity than disapproval. "Your Majesty," Lord Garrett said carefully, "diplomatic solutions require trust. And trust, in these matters, can be a luxury we cannot afford." But surely, Alinor pressed, there is wisdom in understanding a situation before assuming its dangers. What if these travelers seek safe passage or trade opportunities? What if they bring information that could benefit the kingdom? King Rurik had been silent throughout the exchange, studying the map with the intensity he brought to all military matters. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. We will increase patrols, as Lord Garrett suggests. The borders remain closed to all unauthorized passage. This kingdom's safety depends on controlling what enters and what leaves. But Your Majesty, Alinor began. The discussion is concluded, Rurik said, not looking up from the map. Later, as the council dispersed, Commander Thane approached her with something that might have been sympathy. Your suggestion was not without merit, he said quietly. But you must understand, His Majesty's caution is born from experience that none of us would wish to repeat. What experience? Alinor asked, though she suspected the answer would involve the Queen, whose chambers she had discovered. Thane glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. Diplomatic missions, trust extended to those who seemed friendly, information shared with those who claimed to seek only trade and safe passage. His voice dropped even lower. The very intelligence that led to Queen Alara's death came through such channels. That evening, for the first time since her arrival at the castle, King Rurik sought her out personally. She was in her chambers, reading by candlelight, when he actually knocked, rather than simply entering as was his royal prerogative. "May I enter?" he asked, and the simple courtesy surprised her. "Of course, Your Majesty." He stepped into the room but remained standing, as if uncertain whether he was welcome to make himself comfortable. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the space, she in a simple shift and robe. He still in the formal attire of kingship, but with his guard lowered enough that she could see the man beneath the crown. "Your suggestions in the council today," he said finally. "They were not inappropriate, but they were naive." Were they? Alinor set aside her book and met his gaze directly. Or were they simply different from the path you have chosen? Something flickered in his eye, surprise, perhaps at being questioned so directly, or recognition of a strength he had not expected to find in the woman he had impulsively made his queen. The morning mist clung to the castle walls like spectral fingers, as Alinor made her way to what had once been Queen Alara's garden. She carried with her a collection of tools borrowed from the groundskeepers, though borrowed was perhaps too generous a term, given that she had simply taken them from the tool shed without asking permission. Sometimes she was learning, queenly. Privilege meant taking action first and explaining later. The garden journal lay open beside her as she worked, its detailed diagrams serving as her guide through the wilderness that the growing spaces had become. Clearing the weeds was harder work than she had anticipated. 10 years of neglect had created a tangle of thorny vines and invasive plants that seemed determined to choke out any trace of the careful cultivation that had once flourished here. But beneath the chaos, she began to find treasures. A patch of mint that had somehow survived and spread into a fragrant carpet. Rose bushes so overgrown they looked like impenetrable thickets, but with stems still strong and root systems still vital. Herb plants that had been carefully bred for the mountain climate, now wild but still recognizable to someone who knew how to look. "Your Majesty." The voice startled her from her work, and she looked up to find Peter, the young servant who had been assigned to attend her needs, standing at the edge of the garden with an expression of mild panic. "You are needed in the great hall. The king has called for you." Alinor looked down at her dirt-stained dress, her muddy hands, the general dishevelment that came from wrestling with a decade's worth of neglected plantings. "Could you ask His Majesty if the matter might wait?" "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty." He seemed urgent. She found Rurik in the great hall with Commander Thane and Brother Marcus. The three men bent over a table covered with reports and maps. When she entered, still brushing soil from her hands. All three looked up with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed alarm. "Where have you been?" Rurik demanded. "Working in the gardens, Your Majesty." She saw no point in dissembling. "The gardens were sealed by royal decree," he said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that warned of storms brewing. "They are not to be disturbed." "Then perhaps it is time to reconsider that decree," Alinor replied with a calmness she did not entirely feel. "The castle pays merchants high prices for herbs that could be grown in our own soil. We import healing plants that once flourished in these mountains. We maintain the security of this kingdom by not indulging in sentiment." Rurik cut her off. "Those gardens are a monument to—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw working as if the words had lodged in his throat like stones. "To your wife's memory," Alinor finished quietly. "Yes, I know. I found her journal, her plans, her hopes for what those spaces could become. But tell me, Your Majesty, would Queen Alara want her work to die with her? Would she want useful knowledge to be wasted because grief has made it too painful to remember?" The silence that followed was brittle as winter ice. Commander Thane cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Brother Marcus found sudden interest in the scrolls before him. But Rurik's eyes never left Alinor's face, and in them she saw a war between anger and something that might have been recognition. "You know nothing of what she would have wanted," he said finally, but the words lacked the cutting force of true conviction. "Then tell me," Alinor challenged. "Help me understand the woman whose place I am meant to fill." For a moment she thought he might actually answer. His expression softened fractionally, and she glimpsed the man who had once loved deeply enough to build a kingdom around that love. But then his defenses reasserted themselves, and the king's mask slipped back into place. "The urgent matter," Commander Thane interjected diplomatically, "concerns the border reports from yesterday." Rurik turned back to the maps with relief that was almost palpable. "The scout groups have been identified. They are not random travelers. They move with military precision, and their routes suggest reconnaissance rather than trade or passage-seeking." "How many?" Alinor asked, moving closer to examine the markings on the map. "Small groups of 8 to 12, but coordinated. 4 separate incursions over the past week, each probing different sections of our defenses." Thane traced the routes with his finger. "They're mapping our patrol patterns, testing response times, looking for weaknesses. Preparing for something larger," Rurik concluded grimly. "The question is whether this is opportunistic raiding or part of a coordinated campaign." Alinor studied the map, noting the patterns that the men had marked. "What if it's neither?" she said slowly. "What if they're not preparing to attack us at all?" "Explain," Rurik commanded. "Look at the timing, the routes they're taking. They're not avoiding our patrols. They're practically advertising their presence. If these were true reconnaissance missions, wouldn't they be more careful to remain undetected?" Commander Thane frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "That perhaps they want to be seen. That perhaps someone is trying to provoke a response to make us commit troops to border defense, to pull our attention in multiple directions." Alinor traced a different pattern on the map. What if the real threat is not these small groups, but something else entirely? It was a possibility that clearly had not occurred to either of the military men, and Alinor saw them exchange glances that held both surprise and grudging consideration. But before either could respond, a page burst into the hall with the breathless urgency of someone bearing crucial news. "Your Majesty, Commander Thane, a messenger has arrived from the village of Thornwick. There has been an incident. People are dead." The color drained from Rurik's face. Thornwick was the largest of the border settlements, home to nearly 300 souls who lived under the protection of Castle Valdris. What kind of incident? "Poisoned grain, Your Majesty. 7 families affected. 12 people dead so far." The messenger says more are sickening. Poisoned grain, Brother Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with implications none of them wanted to consider. Could it be natural? Alinor asked. Grain rot? Contamination from storage? The grain came from the castle stores, the page replied. It was part of the winter distribution sent out last month. The words hit the room like a physical blow. If grain from the castle stores had been poisoned, it meant one of two equally terrifying possibilities. Either their food supply had been compromised by accident, a catastrophic failure of storage, and management, or someone with access to the castle stores, had deliberately poisoned supplies meant for the villages. Seal the remaining stores immediately, Rurik commanded. No food leaves the castle until every grain has been tested. Send physicians to Thornwick with whatever remedies they can carry. And I want a full investigation. Who had access to that grain, how it was stored, who supervised its distribution. As orders flew and people scattered to carry them out, Alinor found herself standing beside the map table with a growing certainty that chilled her more than the mountain wind. The timing was too convenient, too perfectly coordinated with the border incursions. Someone was attacking Valdris not with armies or sieges, but with poison and fear, turning the king's own protective policies into weapons against his people. Your Majesty, she said quietly when the initial chaos had subsided. The border scouts, the poisoned grain, what if they are connected? What if someone is trying to destabilize the kingdom from within, while making it appear the threats come from without? Rurik's eyes met hers across the table, and in them she saw the terrible recognition of possibility becoming probability. If that is true, he said slowly, then we are facing an enemy who knows our weaknesses better than we know them ourselves. An enemy who has been watching and planning for a very long time, Alinor agreed, and one who may already be inside our walls. The investigation began at dawn with the methodical thoroughness that Commander Thane brought to all military operations. Every servant who had handled the grain was questioned, every storage chamber examined, every record of distribution scrutinized for irregularities. But as the hours passed, what emerged was not evidence of sabotage, but rather a picture of routines so established and trust, so complete that anyone with sufficient access could have acted without detection. Alinor found herself drawn into the investigation almost by necessity. Her questions about storage procedures and distribution records proved surprisingly insightful, perhaps because she approached the problem from the perspective of someone who had spent years calculating precisely how much food was needed to survive lean times. Where the military man looked for signs of enemy action, she looked for the kind of careful planning that such an operation would require. The poisoned grain was from the stores distributed 6 weeks ago, she observed as they reviewed the quartermaster's records in the castle's main archive. But the deaths in Thornwick only began 3 days ago. Why the delay? Brother Marcus, who had joined the investigation because the castle's records fell partly under his domain, looked up from a ledger with interest. An excellent question. Most grain poisons would act much more quickly. Unless, Commander Thane said slowly, the poison was designed to accumulate over time. Something that would not show immediate effects, but would build in the system, until it created a crisis that could be blamed on external enemies. Alinor finished. Thornwick is a border village. If people began dying there from mysterious causes, the natural assumption would be enemy action. The implications were chilling. Such a poison would require not only access to the grain stores, but also sophisticated knowledge of toxins and their effects, the kind of expertise that spoke of education and planning rather than opportunity and impulse thought as they worked. Alinor became increasingly aware of being watched. Not openly, the castle staff were too well trained for that, but with the subtle attention of people trying to gauge whether the new queen represented opportunity or threat. She caught glimpses of conversations that stopped when she approached, noticed how certain nobles seemed to fade from rooms when she entered, felt the weight of calculations being made behind carefully neutral expressions. The feeling was strongest around Lord Garrett, whose opposition to her elevation had been politely but unmistakably clear from the beginning. During the evening meal, as the investigation's findings were discussed in carefully neutral terms, she noticed how his questions seemed designed to probe what they had discovered, rather than to offer assistance in discovering more. Perhaps, he suggested as servants cleared the tables, we should consider that this tragedy may be precisely what it appears, a failure of storage rather than enemy action. Grain can spoil in ways that create dangerous compounds, especially when stored through harsh winters. The grain was tested when it was stored, Commander Thane replied. Standard procedures were followed. Procedures can fail, Lord Garrett pressed. Men can make mistakes. Must we assume conspiracy when incompetence might suffice? It was a reasonable argument, delivered with the authority of someone whose counsel had been valued for years. But something in his manner, perhaps the slight eagerness with which he offered alternatives to investigation, or the way his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing the specifics, made Alinor study him more carefully. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she made her way to Queen Alara's chambers with a growing conviction that the answers she needed lay not in military records, but in the personal history of the kingdom. The journal that had first drawn her to the abandoned rooms contained more than garden plans. It held observations about court life, notes about personalities and relationships, the careful thoughts of a woman who had understood that political intelligence could be as valuable as military strength. Lord Garrett has been most helpful with the grain distribution oversight. Read one entry from 3 months before Alara's death. Though I confess his suggestions often seem designed more to benefit his own holdings than the kingdom's needs. Rurik trusts him completely, perhaps too completely, but loyalty, earned in battle, does not always translate to loyalty in peacetime governance. Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before the Queen's death, was even more pointed. Strange how often Lord Garrett finds reasons to meet with merchants from the eastern kingdoms. And stranger still how those meetings always seem to concern supplies and routes that could benefit his family's trading interests. I have tried to discuss my concerns with Rurik, but he sees only the man who saved his life at Crimson Vale, not the man who might sell our secrets for the right price. Alinor felt her blood chill as she read. Could it be that simple? That, conspiracy threatening Valdris was not some external enemy, but a trusted advisor, whose loyalties had been compromised by greed or resentment. The timing certainly fit. Lord Garrett would have had access to information about the grain distributions, knowledge of castle routines, and connections to outside contacts who might provide both poison and coordination. But suspicion was not proof, and accusations against a man who had served the crown for decades would require evidence stronger than the worried notes of a dead queen. Alinor spent the remaining hours before dawn carefully reading through every reference to Lord Garrett in Alara's journal, building a picture of a man whose outward loyalty masked increasingly questionable private dealings. The next morning brought news that transformed suspicion into urgent necessity. A rider arrived from the village of Millhaven, Alinor's own birthplace, with word that several families there had also fallen ill after consuming grain from the castle stores. The pattern was spreading, and with it the very real possibility that panic would soon grip every settlement under Valdris's protection. We must issue a recall of all distributed grain immediately, Brother Marcus urged as the emergency council convened. Whatever the source of the contamination, we cannot risk further casualties. A recall will create exactly the kind of panic our enemies would want, Lord Garrett countered. Better to investigate quietly while increasing medical support to affected areas. A wholesale recall suggests we have lost control of our own supply systems. Better to suggest incompetence than to allow people to die from our grain, Alinor said sharply, her patience for diplomatic niceties exhausted by the urgency of the crisis. Your Majesty speaks from laudable compassion, Lord Garrett replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. But perhaps those of us with more experience in crisis management should consider. Alinor interrupted, rising from her chair with the authority that she was only beginning to understand. That someone in this room may have a very personal interest in preventing a thorough investigation of these poisonings. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Lord Garrett's expression flickered between surprise and something that might have been fear, while Commander Thane's hand instinctively moved toward his sword hilt. That is a serious accusation, Lord Garrett said carefully. It is, Alinor agreed, and one that I intend to prove before more innocent people die. The chalice was hidden behind a loose stone in the wall of Lord Garrett's private chambers, wrapped in oiled cloth like a treasure too precious to risk exposure to air. Alinor's hands trembled as she unwrapped it, recognizing immediately the ornate silverwork and distinctive blue enamel that marked it as part of the royal ceremonial service. She had seen its twin in the Great Hall, used for formal toasts and state occasions, but this one bore stains that no amount of polishing could completely remove. The search of Lord Garrett's rooms had been Rurik's decision, made after Alinor's accusation had prompted the Lord to flee the castle in the middle of the night. His sudden departure had been all the evidence the king needed that his trusted advisor's loyalties had indeed been compromised. But finding the actual murder weapon that had killed Queen Alara 10 years ago was a discovery that shattered every assumption about the nature of their current crisis. This is impossible, Commander Thane whispered, staring at the chalice as if it might vanish if he looked away. Lord Garrett was with us at the eastern borders when Queen Alara died. He was leading the patrol that intercepted the enemy messengers we thought brought the poison. Because he knew exactly where those messengers would be, Alinor said, the terrible logic of the conspiracy becoming clear even as she spoke. Because he arranged for them to be there, carrying evidence that would point to external enemies while hiding his own guilt. Brother Marcus, who had been examining the cloth wrapping, looked up with an expression of profound sorrow. This bears Lord Garrett's personal seal embossed into the fabric. He has been keeping this as, what? A trophy? Evidence of his success? King Rurik stood motionless in the center of the room, his face a mask of controlled devastation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man whose entire understanding of his life's defining tragedy had just been overturned. 10 years, he said quietly. 10 years I have blamed foreign enemies for my wife's death. 10 years. I have isolated this kingdom, banned women from court, built walls against the world, all to protect against a threat that was already inside our gates. Your Majesty, Alinor began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Do you understand what this means? He continued, his control beginning to fracture. Every decision I have made, every policy I have imposed, every life I have shaped with my grief, all of it based on a lie, all of it serving the very man who murdered the woman I loved. The rage that followed was terrible to witness. Rurik swept Lord Garrett's desk clear with a single violent motion, sending papers and inkwells crashing to the floor. He drove his fist into the stone wall with enough force to split his knuckles, and for a moment, Alinor thought he might destroy the entire room in his fury. But then, as suddenly as it had come, the rage collapsed into something worse, a profound despair that seemed to drain all strength from his massive frame. How did I not see it? He whispered, sinking into the chair behind the ruined desk. How did I trust him so completely that I never questioned his version of events? Because he saved your life in battle, Commander Thane said quietly. Because he had earned that trust through years of service. Because the last thing any of us would suspect is that a man who risked everything for his king would later betray that same king for personal gain. But Alinor was studying the other documents they had found in their search, and a new pattern was emerging that made her stomach clench with dread. Your Majesty, I think Lord Garrett's betrayal goes deeper than we imagined. These papers, there, correspondence with merchants, traders, even military commanders from the Eastern Kingdoms. He's been selling information about our defenses, our supply routes, our weaknesses for years. She spread the documents across the desk, pointing to dates and details that painted a picture of systematic espionage. Look at the timing. He began. These contacts shortly after your marriage to Queen Alara, and they intensified in the months before her death. I think he was recruited as a spy, tasked with destabilizing Valdris from within. But why kill the queen? Brother Marcus asked. What strategic purpose did her death serve? It served the purpose of breaking me, Rurik said with bitter clarity. Alara was not just my wife. She was my political advisor, my diplomatic conscience, the voice that counseled moderation when my instincts ran toward warfare. Without her influence, I became exactly what our enemies wanted, a isolated, paranoid king who would cut his kingdom off from the world and weaken it through enforced solitude. The scope of the manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. Lord Garrett had not simply committed murder. He had engineered a decade-long campaign to destroy Valdris from within, using the king's own grief and protective instincts as weapons against his kingdom. The current poisonings, Alinor said, connecting the final pieces of the puzzle. They are not random attacks. They are the endgame of a plan that has been years in the making. Weaken the kingdom through isolation, then create crises that force the king to choose between protecting his people and maintaining his defenses. And when the kingdom is weak enough, Commander Thane concluded grimly, the real invasion begins. If summoned by their words, a page burst into the chamber with news that confirmed their worst fears. Your Majesty, the border scouts report massive army movements in the eastern passes. Thousands of soldiers, siege equipment, supply trains. They estimate the force at 10,000 men or more. How long before they reach our borders? Rurik demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with military focus. 3 days, Your Majesty. Perhaps 4, if the weather slows them. 4 days to prepare for a siege that would pit their garrison of fewer than 2,000 men against a force 5 times their size. 4 days to defend a kingdom that had been systematically weakened and isolated for a decade. 4 days to undo the damage of 10 years' worth of strategic mistakes. But even as the impossible odds settled over them like a shroud, Alinor felt something else stirring, not despair, but a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. Your Majesty, she said, her voice cutting through the gathering gloom. We cannot change the past, but we can still shape the future. Rurik looked at her with eyes that held the first spark of hope she had seen since the terrible revelations. Began. What are you suggesting? That we stop fighting the war Lord Garrett wanted us to fight, and start fighting the war we can win. She moved to the window, looking out over the kingdom that had become her responsibility as much as his. He wanted us isolated, cut off from potential allies, dependent only on our own weakened resources. What if we did the opposite? The borders had been closed for 10 years, Commander Thane pointed out. Our relationships with neighboring kingdoms can be rebuilt, Alinor interrupted. Queen Alara's correspondence shows that many of those relationships were stronger than anyone realized. Lord Garrett made sure you believed the world had turned against Valdris. But what if that was just another lie? For the first time since the investigation began, King Rurik straightened in his chair with something approaching his old authority. You are suggesting we reopen diplomatic channels that have been closed for a decade. In 3 days, I am suggesting, Alinor said with a confidence that came from somewhere deeper than logic, that we remind this kingdom and its people what they are capable of when they fight not from fear and isolation, but from strength and unity. The transformation in Rurik's expression was remarkable to witness. The broken man who had discovered his decade of grief was built on lies began to fade, replaced by the strategic mind that had once carved a kingdom from mountain stone and enemy blood. "Send riders," he commanded Commander Thane, "to every settlement in Valdris, to every ally we abandoned, to every potential friend we turned away. Tell them that King Rurik of Valdris calls for aid not as a desperate man, but as a king who offers partnership to all who would stand against tyranny." "And the people of Valdris?" Brother Marcus asked. "Will learn," Alinor said with quiet determination, "that their true strength was never in their walls or their isolation, but in their willingness to trust and support each other." The transformation of Castle Valdris began before dawn on the first day of preparation, with the sound of the great war horn echoing across the mountains for the first time in 10 years. The ancient bronze instrument, carved with runes that spoke of battles won and kingdoms defended, sent its deep call. Rolling through the valleys like thunder made music. In the villages below, people stopped their morning work to listen, remembering when that sound had meant victory and hope rather than the silence of isolation. Alinor stood beside Rurik on the castle's highest tower as the horn's echoes faded, watching the immediate response their call had prompted. Already, riders were streaming out from the castle gates, carrying messages to every corner of the kingdom and beyond. The diplomatic correspondence that Queen Alar had carefully maintained, hidden away in Lord Garrett's treacherous hands for years, now served as the foundation for desperate appeals to old allies and potential friends. "Do you truly believe they will come?" Rurik asked, his voice carrying exhaustion that spoke of sleepless hours spent planning what might be their kingdom's final battle. After 10 years of silence, 10 years of rejection, why should anyone risk their soldiers for Valdris? "Because you are not asking them to die for your pride," Alinor replied, placing her hand over his on the stone battlement. "You are asking them to stand against an enemy that threatens us all." Lord Garrett's correspondence proves that this invasion is just the beginning once Valdris falls. The eastern kingdoms will turn their attention to conquest after conquest until no free realm remains. In the 3 days since they had uncovered the conspiracy, Rurik had undergone a transformation as dramatic as his kingdoms. The man who had sealed himself away in grief and mistrust was learning to open his heart again, to trust not only in love, but in the strength that came from connection and shared purpose. It was not an easy transition. Alinor could see the effort it cost him every time he chose vulnerability over control, cooperation over command. The war preparations proceeded with the frantic efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on accomplishing the piasted impossible in impossibly little time. Commander Thane had thrown himself into the logistics of defense with the grim determination of a man who had seen enough battles to know exactly how desperate their situation was. The castle's garrison of 1,800 men would be expected to hold walls designed for a much larger force against enemies who outnumbered them more than 5 to 1. But numbers alone did not tell the whole story of their preparation. In the armory, weapons that had not seen use in years were sharpened and tested. In the storerooms, supplies were inventoried and rationed with the precision that would be needed for a siege of unknown duration. In the stables, horses were prepared for the kind of cavalry actions that might break an enemy charge or carry urgent messages to distant allies. More importantly, the people of Valdris were remembering what it meant to fight for something rather than merely against it. When word of the conspiracy spread through the villages, the response was not panic but fury, a righteous anger that had been building for 10 years and now finally had a target worthy of its focus. Farmers arrived at the castle with their hunting bows and knowledge of every secret path through the mountains. Miners brought their expertise in underground construction and the kind of explosive compounds that could bring down enemy siege engines. Even the elderly contributed what they could, sharing memories of past battles and strategies that had served kingdom well in earlier conflicts. Alinor found herself at the center of much of this preparation, not because she sought leadership, but because people naturally turned to her for the kind of guidance that balanced Rurik's military expertise. Where he focused on defensive positions and tactical deployments, she addressed the human elements that would determine whether their army fought with hope or desperation. The children and elderly will be housed in the deepest levels of the castle, she announced to the assembled village representatives who had gathered in the great hall. But this is not surrender, this is strategic positioning. From those secure locations, they will coordinate supply distribution, tend to wounded, and maintain the communication networks that will keep our forces connected. It was a role she had never expected to fill, and one that Queen Ilara's journal had helped her understand. Leadership in crisis was not about grand gestures or inspiring speeches. It was about the 1,000 small decisions that kept people fed, motivated, and focused on survival rather than despair. The most crucial element of their preparation involved the diplomatic missions that were even now racing across the countryside toward kingdoms that had not heard from Valdris in a decade. Each rider carried not only messages requesting military aid, but copies of Lord Garrett's correspondence proof that the threat they faced was part of a larger campaign that would eventually reach every free nation if not stopped at Valdris. Even if half our messengers reached their destinations, Rurik told the War Council on the second day, and even if half those destinations choose to respond, we could see reinforcements that might turn the tide of battle. And if none of them come? Asked Captain Bowen, the gate commander whose practical nature made him voice the fears that others kept to themselves. Then we remind these invaders why Valdris has never fallen to outside conquest. Rurik replied with the fierce confidence that had once carved a kingdom from hostile territory. We make them pay such a price for their victory that their eastern masters will think twice before attempting further expansion. But it was Brother Marcus who provided perhaps the most important insight into their situation. "Your Majesty," he said during one of their evening strategy sessions, "I have been reviewing the historical records of Lord Garrett's family holdings. His lands lie directly along the route these invaders must use to withdraw after their attack. If they succeed in taking Valdris, he stands to benefit enormously from the trade and tribute that would flow through his territory. You are saying he was motivated by more than just gold from enemy kingdoms," Alinor said, understanding the implications immediately. "I am saying he engineered this entire conflict to position himself as the primary beneficiary of our defeat. He did not just betray us. He built a 10-year plan to profit from our destruction." The revelation added another layer to their understanding of the enemy they faced, but it also provided strategic opportunities. If Lord Garrett's ultimate goal was personal enrichment rather than ideological conquest, there might be ways to exploit the differences between his interests and those of his eastern allies. On the final night before the siege was expected to begin, Alinor found herself once again in Queen Ilara's abandoned chambers, but this time she was not alone. Rurik had sought her out there, drawn perhaps by the need to make peace with the ghost that had haunted their kingdom for so long. "I should have listened to her warnings about Garrett," he said, holding Ilara's journal with hands that trembled slightly. "She saw what I was too blind to recognize." "You trusted a man who had earned that trust through years of loyal service," Alinor replied. "That is not blindness. That is the kind of faith that makes good leadership possible, even when that faith nearly destroyed everything I was meant to protect." Alinor moved to stand beside him at the window that looked out over the kingdom they would soon defend. Especially then, because without the capacity for trust, without the willingness to believe in others' better nature, you become exactly what Lord Garrett wanted you to become, a king who rules through fear rather than inspiration. Rurik was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality, not the granite authority of absolute command, but the warmer strength of someone who had learned to lead through connection rather than control. "When this battle is over," he said, "regardless of how it ends, I want you to know that these past weeks have reminded me of something I had forgotten. Strength is not about standing alone against the world. True strength comes from the courage to trust, to love, to build something beautiful enough that people will choose to defend it rather than simply submit to it." "And when this battle is over," Alinor replied, taking his hand in hers, "we will rebuild this kingdom into something worthy of both Queen Alara's dreams and our own." Outside, the first scout's fires could be seen flickering in the distance. The enemy advance guard was within sight of Valdris. Tomorrow would bring the test of everything they had built together in these desperate days of preparation. But tonight, for the first time since her arrival at the castle, Alinor felt truly ready to be the queen that circumstances had made her. The attack came with the gray light of dawn, emerging from the morning mist like a nightmare given form. 10,000 soldiers in the distinctive black and gold of the Eastern Kingdom spread across the valley below Castle Valdris in formations that spoke of professional military planning and overwhelming confidence. Their siege engines rolled forward with the inexorable patience of death itself, massive catapults, battering rams sheathed in iron, towers that could bring attackers level with the castle's highest walls. From the battlements, King Rurik watched the deployment with the calculating eye of a commander who had seen enough battles to read the enemy's intentions in their positioning. Beside him, Alinor wore a simple crown woven from mountain wildflowers, a symbol that had emerged naturally from her work in Queen Alara's restored gardens, representing the connection between royalty and the land it served. "They are confident," Commander Thane observed, studying the enemy formations through his spyglass. "No attempt at stealth or surprise. They expect this to be a straightforward siege with a predictable outcome." "Then let us make sure they are disappointed," Rurik replied, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once led armies to victory against impossible odds. The first phase of the battle began with a thunderous roar as the enemy catapults launched their opening barrage. Massive stones arced through the air, some striking the castle walls with impacts that shook the very foundations, others falling short to crater the courtyard with explosions of flying rock and dust. The defenders responded with their own artillery ballistae and trebuchets that had been maintained with care despite years of disuse, now manned by crews who remembered the old ways of warfare. But this battle would not be won by conventional siege tactics alone. As the enemy pressed their attack against the main gate, Alinor implemented the first phase of their unconventional defense strategy. From hidden positions throughout the castle, signals went out to the village militias that had been positioned. During the night, farmers and craftsmen who knew every path and hiding place in the mountains surrounding the enemy army. The harassment began. Subtly supply wagons that never reached their destinations, messengers who disappeared into the mountain passes, sentries who simply vanished from their posts. The Eastern army had come prepared for a straightforward siege, not for the kind of guerrilla warfare that turned their overwhelming numbers into a liability in the confined valleys around Castle Valdris. "They are starting to spread their forces to protect their flanks," Commander Thane reported as the morning wore on. "Just as we hoped. And their coordination is suffering," Alinor added, watching the enemy formations through her own viewing glass. "Look how their units are beginning to bunch together. They are fighting defensively rather than pressing their attack." It was then that the first of their desperate gambles paid off. A horn call echoed from the southern passes, not the deep bronze voice of Valdris's war horn, but the silver clarion of Nordmark, their closest neighbor and oldest ally. Through the mountain gaps came a cavalry charge that struck the enemy's left flank like lightning. 500 horsemen in gleaming mail, who had ridden through 2 days and nights to answer Rurik's call for aid. The effect on both armies was electric. The eastern forces, suddenly facing attack from an unexpected direction, began to pull units away from their siege preparations to deal with the new threat. The defenders of Valdris, who had been fighting with the desperate courage of the doomed, now fought with the fierce joy of soldiers who saw hope of victory, but the enemy commander was no fool. Rather than allowing his forces to be divided and defeated piecemeal, he ordered a concentrated assault on the castle's main gate, bringing his battering rams and siege towers forward under cover of a massive arrow barrage that darkened the sky. Like a storm cloud, this was the moment that would determine the battle's outcome. As enemy soldiers streamed toward the castle walls under the protection of their massive shields, Alinor made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than remaining safely within the castle's protective walls, she made her way to the gatehouse, where the heaviest fighting was beginning to develop. The battle that followed, Rurik's defiant response, was unlike anything the mountains of Valdris had ever witnessed. Lord Garrett's fury at the rejection of his terms translated into orders for assault so vicious that it seemed to turn the very air around the castle walls into a storm of steel and stone. But where he expected the desperate resistance of a doomed garrison, he encountered instead the coordinated defense of a people fighting for everything they held dear. From her position on the battlements, Alinor could see the broader pattern of the conflict developing. The Eastern army's overwhelming numbers were becoming a hindrance in the confined spaces around the castle, where their formations crowded together and interfered with each other's effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Nordmark cavalry continued their harassment of the enemy flanks, forcing the invaders to maintain defensive positions that prevented them from concentrating their full strength against the walls. But it was what happened next that transformed the battle from a desperate defense into something approaching victory. A second horn call echoed from the northern passes, deeper and more resonant than Nordmark's silver clarion, and through the mountain gaps came the unexpected sight of Westmark banners. 300 infantry in the distinctive blue and silver of their mountain neighbors, led by Lord Commander Eric himself, struck the enemy's right flank with the precision of a perfectly timed cavalry charge. Westmark, Commander Thane breathed in amazement. They have not answered a call to arms in 15 years. They have not been asked to stand against this kind of threat in 15 years, Alinor replied, watching as the enemy formations began to buckle under pressure from multiple directions. The psychological effect of unexpected reinforcements arriving just when hope seemed lost was devastating to enemy morale. Soldiers who had expected an easy conquest found themselves fighting an increasingly complex battle against defenders who seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as the conflict progressed. It was then that Rurik made his own decisive contribution to the battle's outcome. Rather than remaining safely within the castle's protective walls, he led a sortie through the main gates that caught the enemy forces at their most disorganized moment. With Ironwill in his hands and 50 of his most experienced warriors beside him, the king cut through the enemy ranks like a force of nature unleashed. The sight of their king fighting in the front line sent a surge of desperate courage through every defender. This was not a commander sending others to die while he remained safe. This was a leader who shared every risk and every danger with the people he had sworn to protect. But the most crucial moment came when Lord Garrett himself, driven by rage and frustrated ambition, chose to confront Rurik in single combat. The traitor lord had armed himself with weapons from the eastern kingdoms, a curved sword designed for mounted warfare, and a shield bearing the emblems of his new allegiances. "You could have been remembered as a great king," Garrett shouted over the sounds of battle as the two men circled each other in a clear space that had opened around their duel. "Instead, you will die as a stubborn fool who chose pride over wisdom." "I will die," Rurik replied, his war hammer moving with the fluid grace of long practice. knowing that I never betrayed the people who trusted me. The duel that followed was brief but decisive. Lord Garrett was a skilled warrior, trained in the same traditions that had shaped Rurik's own abilities. But 10 years of comfortable treachery had not maintained the edge that constant responsibility had honed in his. King. When Iron Will finally connected with its target, the sound echoed across the battlefield like thunder, and with it died the last hopes of the Eastern invasion. The death of their coordinator and the arrival of unexpected Allied reinforcements broke the enemy army's will to continue the assault. What had begun as a confident conquest attempt dissolved into a fighting retreat as the Eastern commanders recognized that their overwhelming advantage in numbers had been neutralized by terrain, tactics, and the sheer determination of people defending their homeland. But perhaps the most significant moment came not in the heat of battle, but in its aftermath. As the enemy forces withdrew through the mountain passes, pursued by Allied cavalry and harassed by village militias, Alinor made a discovery that would reshape their understanding of the victory they had achieved. In Lord Garrett's personal effects, recovered from his body after the duel, she found not just evidence of his treachery, but proof of something far more: significant diplomatic correspondence that revealed the Eastern Kingdom's larger strategy for conquest, including detailed plans for attacking Westmark, Nordmark, and every other free realm in the region. This was never just about Valdris, she announced to the assembled commanders as they surveyed the battlefield. We were the first target in a campaign that would have eventually consumed every kingdom that values independence over submission. The realization transformed their defensive victory into something much larger, the beginning of a new alliance that would reshape the political landscape of the entire region. By standing together against a common threat, the Mountain Kingdoms had discovered their collective strength and the value of cooperation over isolation. As the sun set on the battlefield where Valdris had reclaimed its independence, King Rurik removed Queen Alara's ring from the chain around his neck for the first time in 10 years. But rather than discarding it, he placed it gently in a pouch that would carry it to the memorial garden where her memory could be honored without imprisoning the future in the grief of the past. 3 months after the battle that saved Valdris, the Mountain Kingdom bore little resemblance to the isolated fortress it had been for 10 long years. The Great Hall bustled with activity as diplomats from half a dozen allied realms worked to establish the trading agreements and mutual defense pacts that would ensure the Eastern Kingdoms never again found such easy targets for conquest. The black cloth had been removed from Queen Alara's throne, not to erase her memory, but to honor it, by allowing the kingdom to grow beyond the grief that had defined it for too long. Alinor stood in what had once been the Queen's abandoned garden, but which now bloomed with life that seemed to celebrate the very possibility of renewal. The careful plans preserved in Alara's journal had guided the restoration, but the garden itself had become something new, a fusion of the old queen's wisdom and the new queen's understanding of what the kingdom needed. Herbs for healing grew beside flowers chosen for beauty, while vegetable plots provided practical sustenance arranged with an eye for harmony and grace. The envoys from Southaven have agreed to the grain trade proposal, Commander Thane announced as he approached through the garden paths. And the ambassador from Ironforge says their smiths are eager to exchange metalwork for our mountain gems. Good, Alinor replied, not looking up from the rosebush she was carefully pruning. What about the refugees from the Eastern Territories? The housing in Lower Millhaven is nearly complete. Brother Marcus estimates we can accommodate another 50 families by winter, with more construction planned for spring. The integration of refugees who had fled the Eastern Kingdom's oppressive rule had become one of Valdris's most important contributions to the regional recovery. These were people who brought with them not only tales of tyranny, but also skills and knowledge that enriched the Mountain Kingdom in ways that pure isolation never could. King Rurik appeared at the garden's entrance, but he waited for permission. before approaching a small courtesy that spoke to the new dynamic they had built together. Where once the kingdom had been ruled by the absolute will of a single authority, now it was governed by the partnership of two people who had learned to balance strength with wisdom, protection with compassion. The final reports from the Eastern campaign, he said, offering her a scroll sealed with the emblems of their allied commanders. The coalition forces have secured the last of the mountain passes. The Eastern kingdoms have agreed to terms that will prevent further expansion attempts for at least a generation. Alinor accepted the scroll but set it aside to finish her work with the roses. The kingdom's business was important, but it no longer consumed every moment of their lives with the urgency that had characterized their early months together. They had learned the value of taking time for simple tasks that connected them to the land and people they served. "And the memorial service for Queen Alara?" she asked. "Brother Marcus has everything prepared. The ceremony will be held at sunset, just as you requested." The memorial service had been Alinor's idea, a way to honor the woman whose death had shaped so much of their recent history while officially acknowledging that the kingdom was ready to move forward. It would not erase the past or diminish Alara's importance, but it would mark the transition from grief-driven isolation to hope-inspired growth. That evening, as the mountain peaks caught the last light of day and painted the sky in shades of golden rose, the people of Valdris gathered in the memorial garden for a ceremony unlike any the kingdom had witnessed. There were no black banners or mournful dirges. Instead, there was music that celebrated life and memory, flowers that honored beauty and renewal, and words that acknowledged both loss and hope. "Queen Alara understood something that I had forgotten," Rurik said as he addressed the assembled crowd. "She knew that a kingdom's true strength comes not from its walls or its armies, but from the connections between its people and their willingness to care for each other even in difficult times." He paused, looking out over faces that had been marked by 10 years of hardship, but were now bright with the possibility of better days ahead. "She would have wanted us to remember her not through sorrow, but through the joy we find in building something beautiful together." Alinor stepped forward to place the final element of the memorial, not a statue or monument, but a living tree that would grow and change with the seasons, providing shade and beauty for generations yet to come. As she settled the young oak into the soil that had been prepared for it, she felt the completion of a journey that had begun with a desperate search for bread and led to the discovery of purposes she had never imagined. The ceremony concluded with the lighting of lanterns that would be carried throughout the kingdom, not as symbols of mourning, but as beacons of hope that would remind every settlement of their connection to each other and to the future they were building together. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the lanterns disappeared into the darkness like earthbound stars, Rurik and Alinor found themselves alone in the garden where their story had truly begun. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, settling beside her on the stone bench that faced the memorial tree. "The life you gave up when you accepted that crown?" Alinor considered the question seriously, thinking of the simple cottage that had once been her entire world, the quiet routines that had defined her existence before she became part of something larger and more complex. "I regret that it took desperation to bring me to your gates," she said finally. "I regret the years of isolation that kept us from finding each other sooner. But I do not regret the choice to stay, to fight, to build something that neither of us could have created alone." They sat in comfortable silence as the mountain wind carried the scents of the garden around them, lavender and roses, herbs and growing things that spoke of life continuing and hope renewed. In the distance, the lights of the villages twinkled, like promises of warmth and welcome, while above them the ancient peaks stood guard over a kingdom that had learned the difference between strength and isolation, between protection and fear. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years, Rurik had said on the day that changed everything. Now, watching the woman who had become his partner in every sense that mattered, He understood that some searches end not when we find what we were looking for, but when we discover what we never knew we needed.